Thanks, Eric. I feel a little bit like I'm at one of those revival meetings. Just our first three speakers. We've got all that heads going up and down. I almost heard the amens coming from us. So it's really not those of us in this room who need convincing, I think, of the importance of engaging Asia. But nonetheless, I think it's necessary for us to pool our thinking about it in order to sharpen our understanding and the arguments that we will use to work with those who are a little less persuaded of this than we. So I certainly value the interaction that we're going to have, not only this panel, but thanks to Rich and Eric for this for putting this event together. Now, this shift of the world's economic and military center of gravity to Asia, much remarked, much known. In fact, Rich told us earlier that it's already happened, and okay, certainly the trends are in that direction. But I think a little less well understood, although we've had references to it already, is that Asia's military, economic, values, and political structures are all evolving. So you have power moving, but these structures to accept it and use it are not fixed yet. Very fluid situation. And by structures, I mean the combination of formal international frameworks, informal relationships, instinctive behavior of governments and of publics as they approach issues. And these Asian relationships are very much works in progress. And the outcome of these developing structures matters very much to the United States. It will affect our prosperity and our security for decades. The United States has always played an important role in these developments in Asia in the past, and we can play the same role in the future if we pursue a persistent, active role that promotes not only American national interests, but common goods, and takes advantage of the different components of our activities and our policies in the region. Now, Asia is going to develop its own structures, whether the United States participates or not. It's hard to see here in Washington, but when you're there in the region, there's just a constant flow among Asian government officials, businessmen, religious figures, unofficial organization. They're all continually meeting, developing relationships, making plans for the future, trying things out, creating new structures, rejecting old ones. And out of this welter of activity will emerge these regional structures that will set the ways and means for relationships in the region, the way that Asia acts. And Americans are participating in some of this activity, but we're also missing important parts of it. And we need to play harder, I think, to be more effective. Now, there have been many learned tomes written about Asian culture and American culture, but I'm going to give sort of a layman's view, which is that there is far more in common between American goals and the goals of most countries in the region. Safe and secure borders with governments not only not threatened by their neighbors, but able to enforce the rule of law throughout their territory. Free market economic systems with free trade among countries. Representative governments following the rule of law, respecting the rights of minorities, and providing their citizens a chance to develop to their full potential. I think goals are shared by most Asian countries that I'm familiar with, as well as the United States. But I think it's less likely that Asia will achieve these goals without a strong role played by the United States. We're the only Asian nation that's not located in Asia, and that provides a certain amount of trust. But because we're a long plane ride away, we have to work harder in Nepal, Sri Lanka, minor ones in Indonesia, the southern Philippines, and all of them outside countries favor resolution of the conflict within a unified country, rather than exploiting events to extend influence, to compete, to try to break up countries and pull and extend their orbits of power. And the anchor of this overall security architecture is, of course, the United States, with a combination of alliances and partnerships and a strong forward military presence. It has been this American military presence that has provided deterrence of cross-border aggression, that has provided reassurance to allies and partners seeking peaceful development, and in many cases provided the environment for it to happen. The Pacific Command, our military organization in Asia, is so ubiquitous that it's often taken for granted as really part of the fabric of the region. Americans become aware of it when incidents like last fall's refusal of a port visit to Hong Kong by China occurred, or just last week when Admiral Keating was on a C-130 flying into into Myanmar. But really, this is just the tip of an iceberg that consists of some 700 port visits every year, some 1,700 exercises and other engagement activities with foreign armed forces. And this American military presence in Asia is fundamentally sound, but I believe can still use some adjustments. In Japan and Korea, we need to move our forward stationed forces to bases that are shared by military units of our host country. We need to move them out of populated areas which have grown up around the bases in many cases, where military activities cause resentment and sometimes danger, as they do in any populated area where you got to play around with guns and explosives and airplanes and things that go boom. We need to develop our relationships with India so that we can more easily exercise with the Indian Armed Forces. We need exercise programs that are based on the missions of the future. I'm talking about combating terrorism, enforcing legal uses of the seas and suppressing illegal use, peacekeeping, humanitarian responses. And we need to be inclusive, exercising with all countries that can contribute to these missions of the future, including China. We need to modernize our forces in Asia so that they can maintain their current dominance in Taiwan and Korea contingencies where they're part of that structural framework for peace that I mentioned. Probably the greatest danger to this Asian security architecture is an American military withdrawal from Asia. It's fortunate and important that there are few signs of flagging American military commitment to the region, and those countries that host our forces, either permanently based or in exercises and in logistic support, still remain strong allies, strongly committed. But if you do a little mind experiment and think that without the reassurance of a strong American military presence, in the face of a growing China, a belligerent North Korea, both Japan and South Korea would be forced to look to their own resources for both their conventional and their military security. A region now dominated by economic development and competition could turn to a spiral of military buildups and competition, and tensions and rivalries that are currently in check would dominate regional relationships. This is not the kind of Asia that is in the interests of the United States or of Asia itself. So that's sort of the negative side. On the positive side, this military presence in Asia affects, and as I mentioned, can reinforce other American interests. A prime example in my mind was when the Pacific Command reacted so quickly to the tsunami, along with many other Asian nations, including their armed forces, back in 2003, 2004. It was really that response that managed to turn around and revitalize our relationship with Indonesia and its military and in its diplomatic as well as its military and in its economic fronts, an example of these sort of crosscuts of Asia interests and activities in Asia. Turning to economics, Ambassador Barshevsky will talk about trade policies in Asia, but from a interested but somewhat outsider's point of view, I think we need to keep in mind some of these enormous mutual benefits of trade and the way that it affects our security relationships there. I don't think it's an accident that our bilateral free trade agreements in Asia so far have been with allies and partners, Australia, Singapore, South Korea. Should we reject the FTA with Korea, it will not only be an economic loss, as Congressman Brady told us, but it will also damage our military and diplomatic relationships there as well. And conversely, if KORUS has passed, it will take these relationships to a new level with, I think, great benefits for American security and interest in the region. There are, again, examples when adverse economic actions with allies have hurt our security relationships. The one I personally experienced was when our response to the Asian financial crisis a decade ago was pretty lackluster. It damaged our military relations, our security relations with Thailand. The Thais were much less inclined than before to work with us on basing rights, other forms of support when we responded to common problems within the region. And I'm going on a little bit hazardous ground here, but I think it's important to understand the importance of Asian economic issues in Americans' own economic development. In the 1980s, the amazing Japanese growth rate led to fears that the United States was becoming an economic power, that the United States was becoming a second-rate economic power. As it turned out, this challenge caused the United States, with its enormous reserves of flexibility and self-renewal, to look at what it was doing, to retool and to take its to take its economy to higher levels over the next decade. Now we have China. And as we fashion our response, I think the key is not to embark on a downward spiral of protectionism, but to improve our own education system, our worker retraining programs, our productivity in the service sector that now dominates our economy. Of course, we need to insist on a protection for our intellectual property rights, for the environmental and workers' protection safeguards in Chinese factories. But our fundamental challenge is to raise our game internally so that we can deal with the globally competitive economy that we now must deal with. Turning to values, America has enormous potential influence, both positive and negative. America's entrepreneurial economic system, its brilliant system of higher education, its ideals of personal opportunity and individual rights are enormously attractive throughout Asia, from India through Korea. We should never underestimate the power of the American example in Asia. However, the vocabulary that we use, the translation of these, what I would argue are fundamentally shared values into the Asian context is very important. We have to recognize the Asian traditions of community, the more indirect approach that's often used in Asia. We must find the right words and the right way to make the translation. But there's no fundamental contradiction between Asian values and American values, as was popularly proclaimed sometimes in the past. Asians, like Americans, want their governments to provide opportunities for the fulfillment of individual aspirations. They want a society ruled by laws deriving from the rights of citizens. They want their children to have a better life through higher levels of prosperity, education, and opportunity. Countries like China don't follow all of these ideals now, but they profess them, and there's leverage for the United States in these ideals. And values and securities have ripple effects also. One of the sources of great influence on the armed forces of other countries is the American example of a professional military force under full control of an elected government. That example has played a major role in inspiring many allies and partners in Asia to replace military governments with representative ones, Korea, Taiwan. More recently, I was often reassured by officers, mostly junior officers of countries in Asia, that they all understood that mature military forces concentrated on external threats, not internal threats, and that they worked for elected governments. They did not become governments after they took off their uniform. Although often the services of these officers in their countries didn't follow these ideas, they were generally accepted. They inspired, they led, they made things move in the right direction. Now, the challenge for Asia that subsumes all of these questions, security, economic development, values, is the development of a regional political structure for Asia. The U.S. has actively contributed to this development through our participation in APEC, and Congressman Larson talked earlier about that. But currently you see a number of fledgling political regional organizations competing for status and influence. Things are being tried, new organizations being put together, and they're jostling against each other. There's an understandable tendency among many Americans and many really Asia-savvy Americans to dismiss many of them as talk shops, taking up time with meetings that produce no results, and a certain suspicion of them that they are being set up as alternatives to an American role in the region. However, I think that what we're seeing is the maturing phase of a regional political architecture, and the U.S. should help nurture and facilitate a system that provides security, builds habits of cooperation based on shared aspirations, develops multinational or multilateral standards for governance, for economic activity, and a multilateral instinct for solving problems within Asia. That is, solving them, not just talking about them. I don't think this will be an Asian NATO of some kind, as you often hear blithely thrown around. I think it will be a unique institution, and it's being worked out now. Based on all my interactions with Asian leaders, I can say that they very much want the United States to be involved in this process and to be a part of this structure that eventually emerges. And more active engagement, both bilaterally, regionally, and of course putting more institutional resources on these questions, more time, attention, and travel to the region by senior officials and by others. And this is a unique challenge by the United States, given the global nature of our responsibilities, by the pressing nature of what's going on in the Middle East right now. But with the sort of weight that Asia has in the world and the importance to the United States, it's an investment of resources I think we need to make. So let me sum up by saying I believe most Americans understand the growing importance of Asia in economic and security terms. I don't think they quite understand the exciting reality that a future Asia can benefit both Asians and Americans. Our fundamental goals coincide with those in Asia to a very large extent. American leadership is welcome in the region when handled well. It only takes the expression of American objectives in language that translates into the region, along with persistent, concerted engagement with governments, with non-government organizations, and with citizens. And I would argue that helping shape Asia's future by helping build these regional structures is one of the most important tasks for American leaders for our own prosperity and our own security. In order to be present, to be involved. We have a network of regional relationships in the region. We have a track record in the region that is understood, that can provide the basis for developments of habitable cooperation for common objectives. But to help guide this development of Asia, we need to be there. Members of Congress and their staff certainly understand the importance of physical presence in a constituency in order to have influence. They know they have to spend time at home in their districts as well as on Capitol Hill. And frankly, the same is true to achieve favorable outcomes in this future power center of the world. We need to be there, listening, dealing, working for common goals. It's ironic, really. It's been often remarked the difference in the draw of American officials and others to Europe compared to Asia. When you think about it, Europe has developed structures that seem to suck up a lot of time, meetings, summits, and so on. Asia, which is developing these things, I would argue really needs more time because they're in flux, because you've got to get them right. And yet, ironically, because they're not there, they often don't have the drawing power of the more developed regions. And we need to turn this around. Just one more general final point. Our interests in Asia are interconnected. I learned during my 3 years as Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Pacific Forces, that the different aspects of America's activities and policies and actions in Asia have ripple effects. That the different aspects of America's activities and policies and actions in Asia have ripple effects